When I moved to a small town in the Louisiana countryside, I thought I would finally find peace. After living for years in New York, surrounded by noise and crowds, all I wanted was silence. I rented a simple little house on a quiet street, surrounded by twisted trees and damp swamps that seemed to guard secrets. My neighbor to the right, a man named Ernest Miller, was the typical strange guy in the neighborhood. Tall, thin, always wearing a hat, with a tendency not to make eye contact. He lived alone in an old wooden house, surrounded by a rusted fence and hand-painted signs, "Do not enter, private property, danger." At first I thought he was just an eccentric recluse, but soon I began to notice signs that something was deeply wrong. The first few weeks were calm until I started hearing things at night. It was around 3 in the morning. A strange sound would pass through the wall of my bedroom, coming from Ernest's house. At first, I thought it was just strong winds cutting through the swamp, but no. The sound was rhythmic, deep, like scales brushing against boards. Sometimes this noise was accompanied by a metallic clanking, like chains being dragged. I asked other residents on the street about the noises. The silence of their answers was worse than any explanation. They all looked away, changed the subject, or let out a nervous laugh, as if trying to hide their fear. The only one to tell me anything was a 70-year-old woman, Mrs. Helen. It's better not to get involved. He has things he shouldn't. On a muggy afternoon while I was mowing the lawn, I noticed Ernest's property fence move, as if something enormous had hit it from the inside out. The metal creaked, and for a few seconds, I heard again the sound of scales sliding. But when I approached slowly to take a look, he appeared. Ernest stared at me from the porch, his face impassive, his small dark eyes. With a threatening tone, he simply said, "Mind your own business." After that, I could never look at that fence again without thinking about what might be behind it. Things became unbearable by the end of September. A teenager who lived up the street disappeared on his way home from school. The police searched everywhere, but all they found was his backpack abandoned near the swamp road. That night, I woke up to muffled screams coming from the house next door. They were screams that lasted only seconds, stopping so quickly that I wondered if I was dreaming. But then came the sound, the same dragging of scales, now accompanied by something wet, heavy. Panic seized me, but I stayed still, pinned to the mattress, listening to every second of that night. My biggest confirmation, however, came 2 weeks later. I was driving home from work. It was already late, and I slowed down as I passed by Ernest's house. That's when I saw him. Behind the curtains of one of the lit windows, there was a gigantic shadow moving. It was not human. The body was long, thick, with slow, undulating movements, as if searching for space inside the room. The silhouette rose slightly, and I could clearly make out the head, triangular with a forked tongue protruding into the air. Not one of common size, this was monstrous, big enough to fill half the room. I floored the gas pedal, breathless, knowing that this man wasn't just keeping an exotic animal. Ernest was hiding something too forbidden to be explained, something that shouldn't exist outside the deep woods, something that seemed ancient, dangerous. That night I understood the expression on the neighbors' faces, the collective silence of the street. They knew he had something in there, but they all chose not to speak, as if silence was the only way to survive. And then I realized I had moved into the wrong house, next door to the man who was raising a forbidden serpent. And the worst part, with each passing night, the sound of the muffled screams grew closer. That night, after seeing the monstrous shadow in the window, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I relived that enormous, undulating outline occupying half the room. I knew I couldn't ignore it, but at the same time, talking to anyone meant exposing myself. Who would believe me? Worse, if Ernest found out that I had seen what I shouldn't have, I might never wake up alive. The silence of the neighborhood weighed on me like a pact, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. 2 days later, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a loud crash outside. The noise sounded like breaking wood, followed by a deep, dragging sound I immediately recognized, enormous scales scraping against asphalt. I rushed to the window, my heart pounding, and pulled the curtain just enough to see. What I saw made my blood run cold. Ernest's fence was destroyed, part of it bent outward, and under the dim light of the street lamp I saw the body of the serpent. It was colossal, as thick as a barrel, crossing the street with slow, meticulous movements. With each slide, the scales reflected the light dark green with blotches, wet, It seemed endless. By its size, I'd guess it was at least 10 meters long, but there was something even more disturbing than its size, the way it moved. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't fleeing. That creature was hunting. It slithered into the Collins yard, neighbors who raised chickens and pigs. Seconds later, the silence was torn by gut-wrenching screams. I heard animals thrashing, the crash of a broken pig pen, followed by absolute silence. Instead of squeals, there was only the wet sound of the body coiling and crushing. I tried to close the curtain and shrink away, but at the same time, I couldn't stop looking. That's when I saw the impossible. Mr. Collins, a man in his 60s, ran out into the yard with an old shotgun. He was shouting his wife's name, trying to save what was left. He only had a few seconds. The serpent raised its head as tall as an adult man and struck with force. The colossal body knocked the old man to the ground, wrapping around him. The screams of pain were horrible, sound that unbalances the mind, sharp, then muffled by the cracking of bones. The scene was burned into my mind, his body slowly disappearing in the grip of the coils, as if he were just another prey. Within seconds, he was lifeless. The serpent released what remained and slithered back toward Ernest's house. And I saw something even more disturbing. He was standing on the porch, watching everything, trying to stop it. He didn't shout. He showed no remorse. He just stood there, motionless, like a guardian satisfied to watch his creature act. When the serpent returned, it didn't attack him. It slid under him calmly, entering the house as if it were its rightful home. At that moment, I realized what no one dared to say. Ernest didn't just keep that serpent, he fed it with people and animals. The next morning, the tragedy was covered up. It was said that Collins had been killed by wild dogs and that the pig pen had collapsed from the wind that night. No one commented on the destroyed fence or the screams we all heard. The entire street behaved like accomplices, vaulted shut with fear. No one was going to confront Ernest. Torn between the desire to flee and the need to survive, I decided to stay silent. But the weight of it ate away at me inside. The following nights were even worse. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening to the movements outside. Every morning I noticed the same pattern. The serpent would go out, attack, devour, and return. The cycle was endless. And then on a stuffy evening while I was sweeping my yard, Ernest appeared by the fence and spoke to me for the first time since that initial warning. "I have seen too much, neighbor." He smiled, a brief, cold smile. "I recommend you don't talk about this to anyone. You know why?" I couldn't answer, frozen. He tipped his hat and said, as if sharing a poisoned secret, "She likes those who stay silent. She hates the curious." And he went back inside as if nothing had happened. Body shivered. I knew the threat wasn't just words. The more I tried to report it, the closer I would get to becoming part of that thing's food. And that night, for the first time, I heard the sound of chains dragging outside my own house. I stayed awake all night after hearing the dragging of chains in my backyard. It felt like something enormous had approached my back door, circling the house in silence, just to remind me it was there. I couldn't look out the window. Just the thought of seeing that dark body crossing the grass made my stomach churn. At 4 in the morning, the noise stopped, but a feeling overtook me. It wasn't just a warning, it was testing the limits. The next morning, a small group of neighbors knocked on my door. Among them was Mrs. Helen, the lady who had warned me not to get involved. But this time, her voice sounded different, urgent, almost desperate. "He lost control," she whispered, her eyes misty. "The snake is no longer his, now she hunts on her own." I then discovered that many of the people on the street had known about the serpent's existence for years. Ernest had brought her in when she was young, smuggled, with the promise of raising the biggest living creature in the region. At first, she had been kept in sheds with chains, but over the decades she grew absurdly, far beyond what any boa or anaconda could reach. This was no longer science. It was monstrosity. "If the community reports it, we all go down with it," said another neighbor, a broad-shouldered man with a defeated expression. "But if we do nothing, she will finish us off, one by one." Night. A storm hit the town. Lightning illuminated the swamp behind the houses, and thunder shook the earth. I was sitting in the living room when I heard a new sound coming from Ernest's direction. It was no longer chains dragging. It was metal snapping. I went out onto the porch and saw the scene. The side door of his house gave way, and the serpent passed through as if the chains had never existed. The wood exploded into splinters, and the creature rose in the storm like a demon set free. The rain reflected off its colossal body. I could clearly see its mouth opening, revealing fangs that shouldn't exist in a boa. It was as if the creature had transformed into something hybrid, a distortion of what the natural world would allow. For the first time, Ernest seemed scared. He was shouting from the porch, swinging a club in the air, calling for the serpent as if he could control it back. But it didn't respond. It turned slowly and majestically toward him. Anne swallowed him. There was no struggle. There was no time. In a single motion, it crushed him to the ground and pulled him apart, disappearing into its own body. Ernest, the man who had raised her, became just another meal. After that, the serpent turned its gaze to the nearby houses. The lights went out one by one as the residents tried to hide, but it was already too late. The beast moved with terrifying calm, its body crossing entire yards in seconds. From Mr. Collins' house, there were only muffled screams interrupted by a sharp crack. Across the street, the Parker family tried to escape in a car, but the serpent passed through the vehicle as if it were soft tin, crushing the car against the asphalt. I watched in shock through the crack in the window. The ground trembled beneath my feet. It felt like an earthquake was passing through the neighborhood, but I knew what it was. The endless, unrelenting body of the forbidden creature. Mrs. Helen desperately knocked on my door. "I have to run to the swamp," she screamed. "It's our only chance. The water might confuse the scent." But deep down I knew that even that wouldn't be enough. Still, we ran together through the torrential rain. The serpent, however, was already ahead of us. It seemed to play, anticipating our movements, closing streets, knocking down trees, and surrounding the entire neighborhood. It was a patient hunter, knowing there was nowhere to run. We managed to hide under the bridge that led to the river. The sound of the storm muffled our desperate breaths. We stayed there, wet, trembling, believing we had fooled the thing. But after a few minutes, I realized something that still gives me chills. The river stopped flowing. The current ceased. The water level began to drop, as if it was being sucked away. And then slowly, we saw the gigantic head emerging from the riverbed. Its eyes fixed, the forked tongue tasting the air. It was waiting for us. Silence under the bridge was so complete that the sound of the rain seemed distant. We could only hear the muffled thunder of the river being sucked into some impossible place. And then, suddenly, it appeared. The head of the serpent emerged from the water, slowly like an apparition. Dark stained scales gleamed under the lightning, its yellowed eyes fixed on us, and in that instant, I was certain that the creature didn't just see us, it recognized us. Breath caught in my throat. I could hear the sobs of two neighbors behind me, but no one dared to move. The colossal body dragged itself through the riverbed, filling the space under the bridge with its suffocating presence. And that's when I understood what Ernest had done all those years. It wasn't just creation, nor obsession. He had fed a monster until it became something bigger than the neighborhood itself. The serpent began to move in slow circles, forming a barrier with its own body. We were surrounded again. With each turn, we felt the ground vibrate, the stones shifting under the pressure of its living tons. One of the young men, in sheer panic, ran into the middle of the road. He tried to reach the forest on the other side, screaming for help. He didn't take more than 3 steps before being struck by the creature's tail, a dry, snapping blow that hurled him into the air before he fell with a crack so loud it nearly shattered my own body just hearing it. The serpent didn't devour him. It simply left the corpse there as if it killed by instinct, not hunger. This made me tremble even more. It was as if that attack wasn't about food, but about revenge. With the next lightning strike, I had a full view. The entire neighborhood was falling apart under the serpent's force. Houses crushed into blocks of wood, cars twisted in the middle of the street, trees ripped from their roots. The creature's body spread across the blocks like a river of scales in continuous motion. It was impossible to tell where it began or ended. Mrs. Helen beside me closed her eyes and murmured disconnected prayers. Then she stared at me and said something I'll never forget. Ernest didn't create her. He only woke her up. She's always been here, growing, waiting. When I thought the end was inevitable, the serpent did something unexpected. She stopped in front of us. The enormous head rose slowly, cutting through the rain, and her eyes fixed on those of us still trembling, alive. Her forked tongue sliced through the air as a warning, and then she retreated. It wasn't because she was tired. It was different. She simply coiled up again, circling the devastated neighborhood. and then slithered toward the swamp, disappearing into the deep waters. Frightening than seeing her attack was realizing she chose to spare us. When the day dawned, the town no longer existed. According to late accounts, at least 70 people had disappeared that night, and practically no one outside knew the truth. The local newspapers only spoke of colossal storms that had devastated the town. Strangely, no rescue teams arrived in the following days. It was as if our community had been erased from the map. I left on foot, carrying only a backpack. There was nowhere to stay amid the rubble. It took me weeks to cross the state and rebuild my life, always silent about what happened. Who would believe something like that? But in my memory, one thing has never faded: the last sight of the creature, descending into the swamp's depths. It wasn't just a snake. It wasn't just an aberration created by a wicked man. It was as if it were part of the land itself, a secret buried by time that Ernest had only helped to free. Eternal fear. Today, more than 20 years later, I still wake in the middle of the night to the sound of scales dragging. I still remember the feeling of the ground vibrating beneath my feet. I've changed addresses, states, even names. But inside me, one certainty has never left. She's still there, growing, waiting. And when the hunger returns, it won't just be one neighborhood that disappears, it will be an entire city. And no one will ever believe it until it's too late. You've learned the secret that destroyed an entire neighborhood and the silence that erased all traces. But tell me, what if in the swamp closest to you something similar is already growing? Would you have the courage to look? Subscribe now and continue with me in this dive into stories that no one else dares to tell. Because when the next creature awakens, only those who know how to recognize the signs will have a chance to survive.